In the last lecture, I said that we were going to spend this unit learning the rules for evaluating deductive arguments. Now this week, we're going to learn the rules for evaluating deductive arguments that involve what I'm going to call propositional connectives. Now, what are propositional connectives? Well, in order to explain what propositional connectives are, I first have to tell you what propositions are, and then I can talk about connectives. So first, propositions. What's a proposition? A proposition is the kind of thing that can be true or false, and that can serve as the premise or the conclusion of an argument. Here, let me give you an example. See this book? This book is not a proposition. It can't be true or false, and it can't serve as the premise or the conclusion of an argument. See this hand? This hand is not a proposition. It can't be true or false, and it can't serve as the premise or the conclusion of an argument. But now, suppose I say, the book is in my hand. Now what I just said, that the book is in my hand, is a proposition. It can be true, in fact, it is true, or it can be false, and right now it is false. It can also serve as the premise of an argument. I could say, the book is in my hand, therefore my hand is not free to shake yours. And it could serve as the conclusion of an argument. I could say, you just gave me the book and I haven't let go of it, therefore the book is in my hand. I just told you what propositions are, but what's a propositional connective? A propositional connective is something that takes propositions and makes new propositions out of them. Let me give you an example to illustrate. Consider the proposition, the book is under my hand. Now consider the proposition, my foot is under the book. We can combine those two propositions using the propositional connective and to make the new proposition, the book is under my hand and my foot is under the book. Now what I just said, that the book is under my hand and my foot is under the book, that's a proposition. It's the kind of thing that can be true or false. For instance, right now it's true, and right now it's false. It's also the kind of thing that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. For instance, I could say, what you're seeing right now is really happening. Therefore, the book is under my hand and my foot is under the book. Or I could say, the book is under my hand and my foot is under the book. Therefore, my foot is under my hand. So you see that the book is under my hand and my foot is under the book. That's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and it's the kind of thing that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. So it's a proposition. But it's a proposition that we made by combining two other propositions. See how propositional connectives work? They're beautiful, aren't they? I just gave you an example of a propositional connective. I called it the propositional connective and. But in English, the word and can be used in different ways. It's not always used as a propositional connective. Let me give you different examples of how the word and can be used. Think about the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. Okay, now there are three different ways to understand what that sentence is saying. Jack and Jill could be the name of a fast food company that serves a special stew that's very popular with its patrons. Now, maybe lawyers have been wondering what the ingredients are in Jack and Jill's special stew because many of Jack and Jill's patrons have been coming down with an unusual disease. So lawyers have been asking Jack and Jill to disclose what's in their stew. Jack and Jill has been refusing to do so. But finally, the spokesman for Jack and Jill discloses what's in their stew. I might tell you about that situation by saying, Jack and Jill finally talked. There, I'm telling you that there's a particular company, a company called Jack and Jill, and that company finally talked through their spokesperson. Here's a second way to understand the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. Suppose that Jack and Jill are a couple, and recently they've been going through a tough time. They've been angry and resentful towards each other, and they haven't talked about what's been bothering them. Now, I might tell you Jack and Jill finally talked, and what I mean by that is that they finally talked to each other about what's bothering them. Now that's different from the first example in which I said Jack and Jill finally talked. There, I was saying that a particular thing, the company Jack and Jill, finally talked about the ingredients in its special stew. But in this second example, I'm saying that two things, Jack and Jill, finally talked to each other. Let me give you a third way to understand the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. Imagine that Jack, Jill, and Roger are having a silence contest. They're having a contest to see who can go for the longest period of time without talking. And I'm watching them to see who wins. Well, you call me periodically and ask me, has any one of them talked? And for the first few hours, I might say to you, nope, none of them has talked yet. And then, at one point, you call me and you ask me, has any one of them talked? And I say, well, Jack and Jill finally talked. Now here, I'm not saying that Jack or Jill talk to each other. I'm saying that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. So when I say Jack and Jill finally talked, I'm expressing a proposition that's made up of two other propositions. The proposition that Jack finally talked and the proposition that Jill finally talked. When I say Jack and Jill finally talked, I'm using the word and as a propositional connective. It takes two propositions, first, that Jack finally talked, and second, that Jill finally talked. And it combines those two propositions into a third proposition, the proposition that Jack and Jill finally talked. Now that's a third way to understand the sentence Jack and Jill finally talked, and it's different from the first two. But that's the only way of understanding the word and so that it's a propositional connective in that sentence. So I just explained to you what propositional connectives are. I gave you an example of a propositional connective, and I showed how the English word and can sometimes be used as a propositional connective, but sometimes not. Now, the English language, like every other natural language, contains lots and lots of different phrases that can be used as propositional connectives. For instance, consider the phrase, I believe that. You tell me, Jack and Jill finally talked. Well, I might say, I believe that Jack and Jill finally talked. There, I'm taking one proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked, and attaching a phrase to it, I believe that, to make another proposition, namely, I believe that Jack and Jill finally talked. Or consider the phrase, I hate it when. You might tell me, it's raining, and I might say, I hate it when it's raining. See there, I take the proposition, it's raining, and I attach a phrase to it, I hate it when, to make another proposition, I hate it when it's raining. So these are other examples of how phrases in English, I believe that, or I hate it when, can be used as propositional connectives. They can take other propositions and make new propositions out of them. But and is a very different kind of propositional connective from I believe that or I hate it when. And it's different in two ways. One way it's different is that it makes a new proposition out of two other propositions, not just one other proposition. So when you make a new proposition by attaching "I hate it when" to another proposition, what you're doing is turning one proposition into another proposition. But when you make a new proposition by combining two other propositions using the word "and," you're making a new proposition out of two other propositions. Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. You make the new proposition Jack and Jill finally talked. That's one way in which the propositional connective "and" is different from the propositional connective "I hate it when." But there's a second way in which the propositional connective "and" differs from the propositional connective "I hate it when." And that is that when you use the propositional connective "and" to combine two other propositions into a new proposition, whether that new proposition is true or false doesn't depend upon anything other than whether the two original propositions that you used to build it were true or false. That's all it depends upon. Let me illustrate this point using something we call a truth table. A truth table is a way of representing various possible situations and how the truth of a proposition depends upon which of those various possible situations is real. For instance, consider the two possibilities there are with Jack finally talked. The proposition Jack finally talked could be true or it could be false. The proposition Jill finally talked could be true or it could be false. So, there are four possibilities we have to consider. Either Jack finally talked is true and Jill finally talked is true, or Jack finally talked is true and Jill finally talked is false, or Jack finally talked is false and Jill finally talked is true, or finally, Jack finally talked is false and Jill finally talked is false. Those are the four possible situations. Now, if the first of those four situations is the real situation, so it's true that Jack finally talked and it's true that Jill finally talked, then is it going to be true or false that Jack and Jill finally talked? It's going to be true. Right? Because Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked, so Jack and Jill finally talked. Now suppose it's true that Jack finally talked, but it's false that Jill finally talked. Then, is it going to be true or false that Jack and Jill finally talked? It'll be false. Now suppose it's false that Jack finally talked, but it's true that Jill finally talked. Then, is it going to be true or false that Jack and Jill finally talked? Again, it's going to be false. And finally, suppose it's false that Jack finally talked, and it's also false that Jill finally talked. Then is it going to be true or false that Jack and Jill finally talked? Well, obviously in that situation, it's going to be false that Jack and Jill finally talked. So what this truth table demonstrates is that the truth of the proposition Jack and Jill finally talked just depends, it depends on nothing other than the truth of the proposition Jack finally talked and the truth of the proposition Jill finally talked. In other words, the truth of the proposition that we've used the propositional connective "and" to build depends on nothing other than the truth of the two ingredient propositions that we connected by means of the propositional connective "and." Because the propositional connective "and" works that way because it builds new propositions whose truth depends on nothing other than the truth of the ingredient propositions that go into building them. That kind of propositional connective is one that we're going to call a truth functional connective. Now, "and," the propositional connective "and," is a truth functional connective. But not all propositional connectives are truth functional connectives. For instance, suppose we try to construct a truth table for "I hate it when," the propositional connective "I hate it when." Well, So consider the proposition, it's raining. Now, that proposition could be true or it could be false. Sometimes it is true, sometimes it's false. So let's consider these two possible situations. So suppose the proposition, it's raining, is true. In that situation, is it going to be true or false that I hate it when it's raining? Could be either one. It could be raining even though I enjoy the rain, or it could be raining even though I hate the rain. Or it could be raining even though I'm indifferent to the rain. So the truth of I hate it when it's raining isn't determined by it's raining. So if it's true that it's raining, it's unclear whether I hate it when it's raining. Could be true, could be false. Suppose it's false that it's raining. Then, is it going to be true or false that I hate it when it's raining? Again, could be either one. The truth of I hate it when it's raining isn't determined by the falsehood of it's raining. So even if it's not raining, that doesn't mean anything one way or the other for whether I hate it when it's raining. So once again, if it's false that it's raining, I hate it when it's raining could be true or could be false. So the proposition, I hate it when it's raining, whether that proposition is true or false doesn't just depend on the truth or the falsehood of the proposition, it's raining, that you built this proposition out of using the propositional connective, I hate it when. Because of that, the propositional connective, I hate it when, is not a truth functional connective. It's different from the propositional connective and, which is a truth functional connective. A moment ago, we built a truth table for a proposition that was built using a truth functional connective, specifically the truth functional connective and. But I'd like us to notice something about that truth table. Notice that if we replace the particular propositions that we're putting together using the truth functional connective and to make a different resultant proposition, even if we change the ingredient propositions, the truth table looks the same. Let me show you what I mean. Suppose instead of having Jack and Jill finally talked, we have Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. So now we're connecting two different propositions using the truth functional connective and. There's Jack finally walked, there's Jill finally talked, and then we connect them up into Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. Okay, now the truth of that resultant proposition, Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked, how does that depend on the truth or falsehood of the ingredient propositions, Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked? Well, it's the same pattern we saw earlier. If it's true that Jack finally walked, and it's also true that Jill finally talked, and it's also true that Jill finally talked, then it's going to be true that Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. If it's true that Jack finally walked, but it's false that Jill finally talked, then it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. If it's false that Jack finally walked, but it's true that Jill finally talked, then it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. And if it's false that Jack finally walked and it's false that Jill finally talked, then it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and Jill finally talked. So even if we change one of the ingredient propositions, as long as we're combining propositions using the truth functional connective and, the overall truth table looks the same. We could change them some more to illustrate this point. Suppose we changed Jill finally talked to the zebra escaped. Change it here. notice what we have here. We take two propositions, the proposition Jack finally walked and the proposition the zebra escaped, and we put them together with the truth functional connective and to create a resultant proposition Jack finally walked and the zebra escaped. Now, when is that proposition going to be true? Well, again, it depends just on when these propositions are true. So if it's true that Jack finally walked and it's also true that the zebra escaped, then it's going to be true that Jack finally walked and the zebra escaped. If it's true that Jack finally walked but it's false that the zebra escaped, then it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and the zebra escaped. If it's false that Jack finally walked and it's true that the zebra escaped, then it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and the zebra escaped. And finally, if it's false that Jack finally walked and it's false that the zebra escaped, then of course it's going to be false that Jack finally walked and the zebra escaped. So once again, same truth table, even if we change the ingredient propositions that we're putting together with the truth functional connective and to make the resultant proposition. Now, since the truth table stays the same even when we change these propositions up on top, we could represent that fact by replacing these propositions all together with variables that can range over any proposition. So for instance, instead of saying Jack finally walked, we could just have a variable here, call it P1, our first proposition. Instead of saying the zebra escaped, we could have a variable there, call it P2, our second proposition. And finally, when we put those two propositions together using the truth functional connective and, we'll have P1 and P2. So that's going to be our resultant proposition, P1 and P2. And whatever exactly that is going to depend, of course, on what P1 is and what P2 is. But whether this third proposition is true or false, again, is only going to depend on the truth or falsehood of P1 and of P2. When P1, whatever exactly that is true, and P2 is true, then the proposition P1 and P2 is going to be true. Whatever proposition that is going to be true. And in every other possible situation, that proposition is going to be false. So no matter what proposition we have for P1 and what proposition we have for P2, their conjunction, P1 and P2, is going to be true just in those situations when P1 and P2 are both true. That's the truth table for the truth functional connective and, which we'll also call conjunction.
In the next lecture, we're going to see how we can use the truth table for the truth functional connective and to figure out the rules for evaluating deductive arguments that rely on the truth functional connective and. And in the following 3 lectures, we'll see how we can use the truth tables for other truth functional connectives to figure out the rules for evaluating deductive arguments that use those other connectives. See you next lecture.